All right, so let's get started with our first little project here, which is going to teach you how to saddle stitch. So what we have here is a little heart project where we're just going to take the back side of the leathers. And so on this bridle piece, you can tell which is the back side because it has a little bit more texture versus the front side is nice and smooth. And on your colored piece, again, your front side is shinier and smoother, and this is your back side. So we'll put the back pieces together so you have the front side showing on both sides. And the first step to putting together a project is to thread your needles. You're going to notice that you have 2 needles, and that's because you're going to use both of them at the same time. 1 needle on each end of your thread. So we're going to measure our stitch line, and we can do this loosely. It doesn't need to be exact. So I'll kind of draw a loose circle around this heart. And so I know that that's about enough thread to go around this 1 time. And what we need is we need 4 times this length. So I'm going to fold that over. So I've got 3 times, 4 times, and then I'm just going to actually include a little extra. When you're saddle stitching, it's always better to have a little bit of extra thread versus not enough to finish the stitch line that you're working on. That's pretty frustrating. So you don't want to do that. Usually we are going to do 4 times the length of our stitch line. If a stitch line is extremely short, like only a few holes long, you might need more. You might need like 6 times. Or also when we teach you how to do the corset stitch later in this course, you'll see you'll need more thread for that. Okay, so to thread our needles, you'll notice your needle has a little eye on one side, and your thread is, this is a waxed polyester thread, and it is not actually round. If you take a look at it really closely, you'll notice, I don't know if I can get that into focus, but you'll notice that it's actually a flat thread. So if you're paying attention to that so that it's going into the needle eye with that flat side first, that will make it much easier for you to be getting your thread through your needle eye. If you're having trouble getting it through, a couple tricks that can help you. One would be cutting your thread on a little bit of an angle. So let's see if so hopefully you can see that. It helps if I block there. And so I made it into a point. And then I'm going to take my needle and kind of rub it along that point. So I'm kind of making the wax nice and firm. And that gives the thread a really easy time going through the eye of your needle. If this feels difficult to you, just know that it gets easier with practice. Okay, so we're going to pull a little bit of extra thread through, because what we're going to be doing next to thread this needle is we're going to take the pointy side and turn it towards this tail end. And then we're going to pierce directly through the thread near that end. Hopefully you can see that there, how I'm pierced through. And I'm going to hold this pointy side carefully, not to prick yourself, and take this tail here and just pull it down over the eye of the needle. And then take the main body of your thread and you're going to pull that while you're pulling on your needle, and that's going to cinch this little knot up. Let that get into focus there. So I didn't have to tie a knot. It just was created through that piercing process. Let me show that here again. I'm just going to cut a nice clean edge. Draw the thread along the needle so it's nice and pointy and can easily go through the eye. Pointy side. Now, admittedly, I'll normally pierce just like this, but that puts you in a little bit of a risk of going into your finger. So it is safer if you put the thread down on a hard surface and then pierce through your thread, pull it over the eye, and cinch it tight. And now we have a needle on each end of our thread, and we're ready to start saddle stitching. So I'm going to put these two pieces together. Now, when you are saddle stitching, you do want to think about which is the front side of your piece and which is the back side of your piece. And often that's up for interpretation. So it's something that you are deciding, because what you'll find is that the front side of your stitches will look slightly nicer than the back side. So you'll want to have your best looking stitches showing on what's the front side. For the purpose of this project, I'll call this red side my front side. And also, you'll want to think about where on the stitch line you're going to want to start your first stitch. So something common might be that someone might want to start right here at this point, and they'll go all the way around. But what happens is then we back stitch. So if we back stitch 2 stitches this way, these 2 stitches here are just going to look a little different than the rest, and I feel like the piece will end up feeling a little unbalanced. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to start one hole off to the side, because then I'm going to stitch all the way around back to that starting hole, and then I'll back stitch 1, 2, and that'll feel nice and even. On this project, I could have also done the same thing by starting here or here, and then having my back stitch be nice and even there. Okay, so once you've chosen your starting hole, you're just going to take one of your needles, guide it through the holes of both pieces of leather, and then you're going to even out your thread lengths, because you want the needles to each be an equal distance from your piece. And I'm going to determine which thread is coming out of my top side. And so that's this one, which is connected to this needle. And so I'm going to take that top thread, that needle, and go through the next hole. If you have trouble getting the needle through the hole, just wiggle it a little bit. Sometimes for the first time you're going through, that knot on the end just needs to get a little flattened. Okay, so I put that top needle through. So now both my needles are coming out the back side. This is the one I just put through. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to hold it back and out of the way. Now this is my second needle, the one that was originally coming out the back side, and I'm going to go directly through the same hole that I just came through. And so the fact that I'm holding this back and out of the way, if you can see, it's making space in this hole, because I don't want to pierce this thread while I go through. I want to let it slide right next to the thread that's already in there. So here I've completed my first saddle stitch. You can pull both sides nice and tight. A trick that helps these stitches lay really nice and straight is if you take the top thread and you pull it in the direction that you're stitching, while your bottom thread, you pull it in the direction that you're not stitching. So you pull them in opposite directions, and that helps this thread lay nice and straight. Since I just did this first stitch, I'm going to double check at this time and make sure that my thread length is still fairly even, so I'll have enough to finish the project. If you find that your thread moved while you were completing your first stitch and they're no longer even, you still have plenty of flexibility to even them out now. So now we're just going to continue. We're going to make our second saddle stitch. So top side, we want to always start with the same needle, and we'll always be starting with the needle on our top side. So top side needle goes through the next hole, and then I am going to hold that one back and out of the way. Backside needle goes back through that same hole, pull the top needle in the direction you're stitching, the back needle thread in the direction away from the way you're stitching. And look how nice those first two saddle stitches look. Now, a couple of problems you might encounter as you're stitching around. I'll try to purposefully create them so I can show. I'm going to twist my needle a little bit here as I'm going in. See if I can make myself have some twisted thread. So okay, so right there. I don't know if you'll be able to see that, but what I did was I was kind of twisting as I went through, so this thread isn't laying quite as flat as I would like. If something like that happens, you can gently use your needle to just lift that thread out again part way and just manipulate your thread so that it lays nice and flat. That's going to give you really beautiful stitches. Back needle goes back through that same hole. Pull tight. And as you stitch, you're just going to get into, oops, this time I did really twist that thread. You're just going to get into a bit of a rhythm. First needle goes through, hold that thread back and out of the way. Second needle goes through. Pull tight. One thing you will notice as you're working, since we do laser cut all of our leather, is there is a little bit of char on the leather that remains. And so you may find that your hands get a little bit dirty while you're working, and it's totally okay to take a break at any time if you want to just wash that char off. You may find that your thread gets a little bit dirty as you're working. Usually that happens mostly right here at this knot as it's going through those holes. It's kind of picking up the char for you. And it's part of why we want to make sure that we always have plenty of thread, because then those kind of dirty ends near the needle, they just get cut off. Now, the next problem you might find that you sometimes encounter is if while you're putting your second needle through, you might accidentally snag the thread. Let's see if I can do this on purpose. I'm going to snag it, and oops, I went through my thread on this side. So as I start to pull this through, I don't know if you can see that, but it's going to make my stitch look a little ugly. I've got pieces coming through. It's just not pretty. So a couple of things you can do if that happens. The easiest tends to be to just say, oops, never mind. Let me pull that needle back out through. And so if you can back it out. If it won't come out, you can always cut the needle off. And actually, I'll just show that to you, because sometimes that happens where you get stuck. You're a little twisted up and you don't know how to fix the tangle you've created. You can always cut your needle off. So now I can very easily pull that thread through. So my piercing accident is gone. I'll get this little tail off of this needle by cutting just really close to it, pulling out the thread. And restitching my needle, threading my needle. Now, those are pretty much all of the problems that I can imagine that you could possibly face with this project. As you can imagine, it's a pretty simple project. We're simply going to continue to saddle stitch around in a circle. Sometimes with some projects, it can be easy to skip a hole. So for example, you would never want to skip this hole and go right into this one. That won't look good. In some projects, these pieces are a little farther apart, and so you could accidentally go through the front hole but miss going through the back hole. So the way you avoid those sorts of problems is just by looking at both sides whenever you're doing a stitch, and you can make sure that everything is where it should be. If you find that you hit a problem while you're trying to do this saddle stitch that I haven't covered in this video of how to handle and take care of, I want you to reach out to us. We are here to help every step of the way. This is a real class together, even though we're not live. We're here to support you in this activity, because what we find is as people get a handle on how to do these saddle stitches, it's a really relaxing activity, and you can put together some really fancy projects and feel really proud that you've done so. So we really want you to be successful and don't want you struggling with something if you could have just reached out to us and asked for some help. And you can see in a short amount of time, I'm almost all the way around. So I'm just going to keep going until I am back to the hole I started in. And then that's when we're going to backstitch. And I'm not doing anything particularly fancy with my hands here. I pull that top needle through. I tend to use my middle finger to just hold that thread out of the way, which allows me to take my right hand, I'm dominant on my right side, and put that back needle through. So for me personally, my left hand is always holding the piece with my thumb and forefinger. My middle finger on my left hand holds the thread out of the way, and my right hand is always doing all of the needlework. So from my right hand's perspective, oops, look right there, you can see how I didn't pull tight. So from my right hand's perspective, the needle comes through the back and then back through the next hole. Switch threads, same thing, needle comes through the back, through the next hole. From my left hand's perspective, I'm simply holding the piece and occasionally switching which thread I'm holding back and out of the way. Now you can tell I got a little lazy while I was talking. I have a little bit of a twisted thread there. the thing is, that's okay. It's not going to hurt anything. It's not going to ruin your project. On most things, you wouldn't even notice it. And sometimes you have stitch lines that will never be seen. And if that's the case, sometimes I don't even take the time to watch and make sure that they're not twisted. But okay, here we go. I've just finished this top stitch. And so now both of my needles are on the back side. And so I'm going to do the back needle through. All right, so this is my stopping point for going forward. Basically, I've completed all of these saddle stitches, and you can know that a saddle stitch is complete because you have thread on both sides of the piece coming out of the same hole. So the next step in saddle stitching is to backstitch. Now I will say that even though I call it a backstitch, and I do normally go backwards, and in this case I'm going to go 1, 2 stitches backwards, it actually isn't really any different if you go forward. So sometimes in a project it's easier to just keep going forward. Sometimes it's easier to go backwards. Sometimes I'll have a stitch that it's easiest for me to just go kind of back and forth over that stitch a few times. You're going to do whatever works best for you. Now, typically in most projects, we're going to do 2.5 back stitches. So that would be 1 back stitch, 2 back stitches, and that final half is just the front needle coming back to the back side. On this project, I think I'm just going to do 1.5 back stitches because I like my threads looking really nice and even. So what I did was I took this top thread and I went back right over the stitch I did before. I'm actually just going to undo that and show that again. So here's where I ended. So my first back stitch is, I still start with my top needle and I just go back 1 stitch right on top. And if you want it to look really neat, you can kind of use your fingers to line that thread up so it lands right on top of the previous one. Now I'm going to hold that out of the way. Back needle is going to go through that same hole. And so now I've done 1 complete back stitch. So if I were to do a second complete back stitch, that would be this needle goes through. And then, you know what, I'm going to go ahead and finish this back stitch so that I show you properly that we should always be doing 2.5, not 1.5. So there we go. So there's 2 full back stitches. But what you'll notice is you have a thread on your front side, and we really want to finish all of our stitches on the back side of our piece. So we do what's called a half stitch, which simply means that only the front needle goes through. Now, sometimes you'd probably go this way because I like things being really balanced. I'm actually going to go backwards right here. It really doesn't matter. This craft has a lot of flexibility for you to do what you like and to make your stitches look just the way you'd like them. So now I have both of my threads on the back side of my piece. That's the important part. And I'm going to cut them, leaving about 1/8 of an inch of tail. I did pull them nice and tight before I cut them so that I knew that my pieces were nice and tight together. And you can see those little tail ends. And the next step we're going to do is we're going to melt these thread ends. I don't seem to have a lighter here. I'll make sure to get one for the next project so you can see that. But if we pretend this were a lighter and I were to light it and this were the flame, I would just be holding the flame near the thread ends, like right here, so that the heat from the flame, it's just going to melt this down. Today I'll just be using this little thread zapper. We sell them in the shop. They're just a really easy way without flame to be able to melt your thread ends. All that's happening is as I'm pressing the button, the little tip on this is getting hot, and so it's just melting. And you probably shouldn't push down with your finger like I did. You could get a little burn. The wax is hot when it's melted, so what I would typically recommend actually doing is to say, do what I say, not as I do moment. Once your thread is nice and melty, use the side of your lighter and just push into it. Okay, and I actually just found a lighter here, not a small convenient one, but one of these giant ones we use to light our wood burning fires in our home. And I just wanted to be able to show you how to do this with a lighter. So I just did a fake little quick saddle stitch here and cut off these pieces so that we'd have thread ends to melt. And let's see if I can show you this. And I should actually demonstrate not using my finger to push it down. It wasn't hot when I did that, but you don't want there to be a chance of getting a burn. So what that does is I've created little pinheads here and here from that wax being melted and pushed down, and that will stop this thread from ever pulling back out. So now it's all safe and secure, and your first little heart project is complete.